Chapter 40. Gods be my witness, Mayor Crispin harshly said, but if either of you draws a sword I will have you shot. Angharaide's lips thinned, back straightening as she glared down at the man. She had already given her oath. What manner of honorless cur did he take her for? Kentika's mayor, a middle-aged man with a bushy black beard whose wildness contrasted with the tidiness of his dated woolen green tunic, looked unimpressed by her anger. Glare all you want, girl, but I've permission from the commander and Three Pines to dispose of any of you who get rowdy, the man said. You think you're the first kids with chips on your shoulders who've blown through here? I have no intention of breaking my word, Angharade curtly said. Crispin held her gaze a moment longer. How flat they looked, she thought, almost lifeless, before grunting in what could have been either approval or dismissal. The mayor's dark eyes then moved to Augusto Cherton, who was yet grinning. I only reached for my blade because I felt in danger, good sir, Augusto said. I would not dare to break your laws. Mayor Crispin eyed the Infanzon a moment longer. You're lucky we don't give out beatings for smugness, the mayor finally said. Go stand with the rest. That wiped the grin off Augusto's face well enough. The mayor, stroking his beard, glanced at them one last time then peeled away. The two town guards that had been looming over their discussion leaned their muskets back against their shoulders. Men with much nerve, the Perduri thought. There were only a handful of them, to pen in 5 times as many trial-takers, but at no point had they shown fear at the possibility of a fight breaking out. Angharade supposed that living on this nightmare of a place must do wonders for building one's bravery. You, the new arrivals, Mayor Crispin called out. Send me one in front. The remainder goes with the crowd. The dark-skinned noblewoman turned in surprise. She had not noticed anyone coming. Angharade let out a startled noise at what she found. Tristan, young and the pale-skinned Tsare. The latter looked like she had done best of the three, at least until Angharade noticed the missing fingers. The others looked like they had been savagely beaten and Yang had clearly been shot, but the three were well enough to move. They were warmly welcomed by the rest of their company, Yang more so than the rest. His acquaintance with Lady Feranda and Lord Zenzel was of long date. It was Tristan who limped to the front as they had been instructed. The sole part of him that did not look like it had been tossed down a mountainside, the worn leather tricorn on his head. The Sacromontan had decent taste in that regard, at least. Tredegar, the grey-eyed Manta readily greeted her, offering a nod. Tristan, she happily replied. I am pleased you made it through. How he had done so was a question for later, she decided. There must have been another path through the maze, one that could be pried open without 10 victors. You can have your reunion later, Mayor Crispin said, brusque but not unkind. Tristan, is it? That is my name, the Sacromontan agreed. Should we be expecting further survivors? The man asked. The girl here says all the people she ran the second trial with are accounted for. Our fourth is dead, Tristan replied, face slightly tightening. As far as I know, there are no others left. Angharade could not, in that moment, recall the old man's name. Franco. She had been told it at some point, she knew, and a slight well of shame came with the realization she had not cared enough to remember. Good, Mayor Crispin said, then paused. Tristan was looking at him. The grey stare was even, almost mild, but Angharade shifted uncomfortably at the sight. It was an unsettling sort of calm, the kind that came right before someone smashed a glass against your head or bared a knife. Not good, Crispin corrected, but simpler for us. If everyone is there we can get the trial of weeds going. Tristan cocked his head to the side. Do you need anything else of me? He asked. No, the mayor grunted, then flicked a glance her way. Same with you, Mulaney. You can join the others. Angharade smoothed away her irritation at the inaccuracy and inclined her head in acknowledgement, keeping the other trial-taker company on the short walk. No words were shared, the only sound their boots squelching in the shallow mud. Song was waiting for Angharade when she returned, gesturing for her to come closer while Tristan disappeared into the crowd. Shalini gave them Ishan's body, the Tianxi whispered in her ear. They'll burn it tomorrow, after firewood has been gathered. She agreed to part with it. Angharade whispered back, honestly surprised. They didn't give her a choice, Song replied. They wouldn't allow a corpse to be dragged around for fear of disease. Which was, the Perduri admitted, a fair concern. Having her hand forced in such a manner explained why the Someshwari looked in a foul mood, however, ignoring Zenzel's attempts to engage her in conversation. Firanda stood with them, the trifecta having kept together on the march, and Angharad felt a pang of envy. Everyone she had passed the first trial with was now dead or estranged, save for Song. Even Brun, who she thought herself on good terms with, now preferred to stand with Uretsi and quietly converse rather than renew their acquaintance. Mayor Crispin cleared his throat, putting an end to the small talk, and all eyes went to him. First off, the bearded man said, "Since I heard the sanctuary got buried, I'll first ask you this, is there anyone here who would withdraw from the trials?" He waited for a moment, to utter silence. "Last chance," he said. "If you get to hear the rules of the trial of weeds, the only ways you're leaving this island are in a coffin or a black cloak." Still silence. The man shrugged. "Don't say I didn't warn you," the mayor said. "Follow me, I'll give you the rules once we get to the town square." It was not a particularly long walk, though the lackluster streets made it rather unpleasant. They stuck to the sides as much as possible, closer to the occasional wooden planks than the mud in the middle of streets. After 4 minutes of passing shops, houses and a lodge, and the mayor slowed as they reached their destination. The square looked almost out of place given how cramped the rest of Kentika was, all pressed against the palisade walls with narrow streets and rough wooden houses. In contrast, the town square was a wide and open space paved with thick square stones. Spread out across it, facing the center, were 3 large iron cages. Each was taller than a man and long enough you would be able to walk inside. Padlocks hung on their open doors. There was a ripple of unease through their company, which Angharad would freely admit to sharing in. If there had been beasts in the cages they were now gone, and if they were meant for people then. "Here we are," Mayor Crespin said. "Come close now, and no chatting. I won't be repeating myself if you miss anything." Dutifully, their company assembled at the edge of the paved square while the bearded mayor came to stand between the cages. Crespin spat to the side, into the mud. "Now, the watch is supposed to give you some spiel about the nature of the third trial before sending you off our way," he said. "But I'm no watchman, and I've only heard bits and pieces of the speech over the years." He shrugged. "So I'll be giving you my own understanding of it instead." The bearded man swept through them with his gaze. "The trial of lines is a test of skill," he announced. "If you don't have a plan or lick up to people who do, if you don't have the training to make it to the sanctuary quietly or the strength to fight your way through, then you end up dead." Angharad winced at the bluntness of his words, but there was the ring of truth to them. "Now the trial of ruins, it's a pot," Mayor Crespin said. "They throw you into the water and turn up the heat to see what you'll do when it starts to boil. Do you fuck over your allies? Do you break or run or rise up to the occasion?" Glances were sent this way and that at the man's words. Tupac only grinned at the unspoken accusations, entirely unruffled, and a flattering amount of looks went her way at the last part. Angharad straightened her back, allowing herself a sliver of pride. It did not last. "There's not many of you this year," the mayor bluntly said, "so you must not have been great swimmers." There was the ring of truth to that as well, Angharad thought. Near thrice their current number had walked out of the Bluebell. "Now, the trial of weeds isn't like the first 2, Mayor Crespin said. "If you got here, you're good or you're lucky, either way, the rooks can use you." He smiled, just a shallow stretch of the lips that had precious little mirth to it. "No, this place is about ripping out the weeds before they get into the watch, so to speak, and the winnowing is left to your own hands." Another ripple of unease. "We're not going to put any you in these cages," Crespin said. "You are." Few of them liked the sound of that. "Tonight, in the time before you retire to your rooms, each of you will be taken aside and asked to give 3 names, the man said. 1 for each person you think should be put in one of the cages. The 3 of you named the most times will then be escorted into their cage by the town guard come morning." Angharad frowned, then cleared her throat. It earned her an unfriendly look from Crespin. What happens should two of us be named an equal number of times? She asked. It would not matter unless the third position was the one shared, she thought, but should that happen it was possible a draw would need settling. You get to share the cage, the mayor replied without batting an eye. That was, Angharade silently conceded, callously fair. Come morning, you'll gather up here again, Mayor Crespin continued, and after the chosen enter the cages then you get to vote on which of the three will die. You can't be serious, Shalini replied. You want us to kill each other? The man shrugged. You've already been killing each other, I imagine, he said. Now is when you call each other to account for it. He chuckled. I've seen the smile drop off the faces of all sorts of clever sorts, when it sunk it that they might have to pay for their bloody tricks after all, Mayor Crespin said. The way I see it, this test is for them. If you throw your allies to the wolves, well, you best be clever enough to talk them out of hanging you after. The mayor shrugged. What use would the watch have for you otherwise? Half a dozen of them spoke up at the same time even as Angharade's fingers tightened around the grip of her saber. This was madness, she thought. How could they be expected to? Mayor Crespin's hand rose, and silence fell again. No one wanted to risk missing a piece of the rules. It doesn't end there, the bearded man said. After that's done, each of you will get asked a question in private. Should another round be played? You could have heard a pin drop. All it takes is one yes, Crespin said, for there to be another. That is absurd, Augusto bit out. How many of us will die for petty grudges? It was uncomfortable, Angharade thought, to be forced in a position where she agreed with the man. As many as you lot care to kill, the mayor said, indifferent. The trial of weeds ends when refusal of another round is unanimous. After that we'll hand you fresh supplies and you get to toddle on north to Three Pines to join the watch. Though Angharade could feel indignation about to erupt, their company held on to silence a little longer. Crespin liked toying with them. They proved right too, as the mayor chuckled a few heartbeats later. One last thing, he said. There's one last rule, which is a secret you will have to find on your own. A way for someone in the cages not to die even if they get picked. Sniff around for it however you will, so long as you remember the rules, no violence against my folk, or each other. Mayor Crespin offered them a nod. That's the whole of it, he said. My people will find you to ask the names, don't try to go to sleep before you're given leave. He walked right through their crowd, forcing them to part as if to make a point, and for a few heartbeats silence followed in his wake. Then chaos came screaming out. The first thing that happened was that Tupac Sickle walked away. Without a word, ignoring the jeers from Firanda and Zenzel. Angharade searched his face for fear as he walked past her, for regret, but found neither. He looked, to her dismay, thoughtful. He knows he is certain to be sent into a cage, she thought, so he is going on the hunt for the hidden rule that might save his life. He must have committed to that decision before the mayor was even done speaking. It was a tortured thing to admire Tupac's composure. He would not have needed to be composed, after all, were he not a feckless traitor. Everything admirable about him was intertwined with the worst of traits. In a way his qualities made it easier to despise him, Angharade thought, for Tupac was capable of acting with honor should he want to. He had the skill, the discernment. It was a choice for him to be heinous. We should all agree now on who we sent into the cages, Your Etsy was saying. The trial thrives on mistrust. Should we simply be open with, how would we know if someone's lying? Lan casually asked. We'll give our names in private, the mayor was clear about that. Your Etsy turned a gimlet eye on the older woman, Angharade only then noticing that one of her turquoise earrings was missing. It must have fallen during their flight to Kentika. Trust, Your Etsy began, but derisive laughter cut the sentence short. There is still a murderer among us, Zenzel, who'd been the one to laugh, cut in. There should be no talk of trust, Your Etsy. Chaos is to no one's advantage, Song opined. Some semblance of an agreement can only help. You sit on more secrets than anyone here, Tianxi, and some are fresher than others, Zenzel Duma flatly said. I will not invade your privacy by pressing, but do refrain from taking us for fools. I will not be a tool for your schemes. Song met his eyes with her unblinking silver gaze, face hardening. Angharai's brow rose at the tension. That was a strong claim, but a lord of Malin had spoken it, so he must not believe it a lie. And he has a contract that would let him sniff out secrets, she thought. Zenzel had seen her own vengeful oath, though he had not known what it was. And now he says that what Song keeps to herself dwarfs even that. A sobering thought. Yet secrecy was not deserving a scorn. Had Angharad told them all she was pursued by assassins? No, not even when she had foolishly feared that Zenzel Duma and his lover might be killers sent by her nameless foe. There is ruin in all our wakes, Lord Zenzel, Angharad said. To chase each other's shadows is a game without a victor. The dark-skinned noble, taller than her even with his hat in hand, though not by much, fixed her with a steady look. Firanda elbowed him, after which he gave Angharad a curt nod and wrenched his gaze away. Song looked about ready to speak again, but it was another who stepped in first. Master Cosmoflore's flair had never quite recovered from the loss of his hat, but the older man still cut a respectable figure with his finely groomed mustache and beard. The cuts he'd suffered on the toll road only added to it, the bandages around his arm lending him a wounded veteran's look. It was with his hand on the pommel of sword, loosely, resting and not threatening, that he went to stand before everyone. I have made mistakes, Cosmoflore bluntly said. I own that. A burst of shrill, mocking laughter. Oh, sweet mayonnaise, Augusto Cherton said. To think I'd see the day where you bent that stiff neck enough to beg for your life, Cosm. The voyage was worth it just for that. The older man glanced at him with distaste, then ignored him. I tried to keep my oaths to House Cherton beyond what was wise, Cosm said, but never did I bear a blade on any of you, or take revenge for a contract being used on me without provocation. A meaningful look was thrown at Shalini there, who sneered back. If you feel it has grown cold outside, then you should have thought twice before working out, the Someshwari replied. Brun cleared his throat. One does not lightly leave the service of the infant zones, the fair-haired man said. Defiance is not without costs for Sakura Mountains, Shalini Gol. The short Someshwari eyed him with surprise, and some abashment at the reminder that she had come here as the close and trusted companion of a noble, while Cosm was merely a retainer. Angharad, though she kept an eye on the talks, was instead taking measure inside her own mind. Tupac was headed for a cage, that much was certain. He had made too many enemies. The only question worth asking was who else would be headed there. Let us not pretend being a soldier for a house right beneath the six is the same as being a rat, Tristan flatly said. Pity is a fine thing, Brun, but Cosmoflore never gave a shit about anyone but his charges until that bridge was thoroughly burned. And he should be killed for that? Brun challenged. A harsh laugh. You will have to forgive Tristan, Yang said. He's grown used to deciding who lives and dies. That earned the pair measuring looks. It was an obvious break in a previously cordial relationship, but Angharad was yet running down the list. No one, she thought, had made more foes than Augusto Cherton and Cosmoflore. It was near a sure thing that the two of them would be sent to the cages along with Tupac. Only your Etsy, who had fought Tupac and been accused by Shalini, could even begin to come close. Everyone with a gun has that same power, Young, Lan blandly said, and I see you carry two. I don't think this is going well for you, Cosm, Augusto loudly whispered. Perhaps you should. Go with the current, old friend. It will be faster. Angharad almost winced. There was no almost about it for the older man, as she remembered when she had last heard that sentence. To consign someone to the cages does not mean death, Angharad pointed out. A mark of shame, perhaps, but not an oath to send them into the grave. Well said. Young grunted. I have been told I might be bleeding out, so I'm to look for a physician. I will, however, leave you with this, Tupac, Augusto, Tristan. Make of it what you will. He began limping away after. Sare, whose face was flushed pink with exhaustion, traded a look and a nod with Tristan before slipping away from the crowd to help Young limp forward. The veteran looked as if he wanted to refuse, but after a moment conceded and slung an arm around her shoulder as they disappeared into the town. That was most unwarranted, Augusto complained. I've hardly even spoken with the man. Hardly must have been enough, Angharad evenly replied. He cheerfully flipped her the finger, seeming unworried even though he was sure to be bound for a cage. Is this bluster, or is he genuinely without fear? Cosm, whose speech had been diverted by sundry distractions, cleared his throat and claimed attention once more. I have said my piece, the older man said. I can now only trust in the fairness of those assembled here. I truly misspoke when I called you a cock, Augusto mused. How could you be such, when you have such a talent for fellatio? The infant chuckled. I trust in the fairness of those assembled here, he repeated in a nasal voice. At least get on your knees first, if you're going to be working at it so hard. Cosm's cheeks reddened in anger as he reached for his sword, not quite unsheathing it, and even Angharad felt her jaw tighten at the uncouthness of. Augusto had somehow become even more odious since the toll road, and no longer cared to keep his venom in check. By the looks on the face of those around here, that was doing him no favors. But then he would have been headed for a cage even if he turned sweet as honey, Angharad thought. As Mayor Crespin had said, the trial of weeds was a reckoning for the other two. Talking here is pointless, Shalini said. Half of us can't trust the other and there can be no serious talks with snakes coiled in our laps. She's right, Lady Ferranda said. And so was Young, in his own way. She paused. Tupac, Augusto, Cosm. I'll be taking that up with the Vilazar, when I return to the city, Augusto mildly said. The fair-haired Infanzone cocked an eyebrow. That'd be quite a trick, without a head, she said, and walked away. Shalini went with her, and Zenzel flicked them a glance before clearing his throat. Consider Tupac a given, the Milani. The rest bears thought. He then tipped his head at them politely and hurried to catch up after the others. There were still many of them left, Angharad saw. Of the 14 they numbered there were still 8 standing here in the square. But the moment Shalini and the other had left the prospect of keeping this out in the open had died. Even though there were numbers enough here to decide the matter if they wanted to, the illusion of unity had shattered. Everyone would be cutting their own deals, as if this were the High Queen's court. Angharad met Song's eyes and traded a small nod. They were done here, both agreed, and within a minute had taken their leave. However cramped the planks on the side of the street, they were preferable to walking in the mud. Even if it made speaking as they moved somewhat awkward. I have a degree of acquaintance with Sare, Song told her. I will seek her and find out what happened when our company and hers parted way. Angharad could read between the lines. The two women were acquainted, but the Triglav was less than fond of Milani. Understandable, if somewhat unwarranted, Angharad had never owned a slave nor traded in them. Their first conversation after the reveal of her origins had been less than skillful, admittedly, so the Perduri said nothing on the subject. I am rather curious what tunnel they found to escape, Angharad admitted. It must have been unknown even to the watch. They are a canny lot, Song said. I expect it will be an interesting tale. Angharad nodded, then cleared her throat awkwardly. I expect I should speak with Lord Zenzel first, she said. She delicately did not mention that her fellow islander had taken a clear dislike to Song. Said Tianxi eyed her from the side. He is not wrong, the silver-eyed woman said. I keep a great many secrets. Your eyes bind you to such a fate, Angharad shrugged. It was, if anything, reassuring that Song was not prone to voicing the many hidden things that her eyes were certain to reveal by simple virtue of being in their presence. Angharad would much rather the pact be held by a woman inclined to secrecy than a blabbermouth. Song looked away, stepping through the shadow cast by the lamplights above. More than merely that kind, she said. I joined the trials on the Dominion for a particular purpose, Angharad, and thought I am yet bound not to speak of it. The time approaches where I will be able to tell you. That is not necessary, Angharad assured her. I do not begrudge silence, save if it causes harm. It is necessary, Song replied, sounding almost amused. I intend to make you an offer when we reach 3 Pines, and when I make it I would not have you think our entire acquaintance was a ploy. The Perdiri appreciated that, truly. All this scheming and lying, how exhausting it had become. Sifting through every sentence for 10 meanings, every offered hand a trap. Even the closest to a pleasant diversion Angharad had found had been. Her jaw clenched at the memory of how Isabella looked, her face a red ruin. Song's open admission that she was keeping secrets and would offer a bargain was refreshing, a clearly drawn line in the sand. She could do with more of those in her life. "You have saved my life on more than one occasion," Angharad said. "Whatever else may come to happen between us, Song, you may be assured that I will always hear out any offer you have to make." The other woman studied her for a stretching moment, steps stuttering on the planks, and it occurred to Angharad that Song was actually quite striking. Silver eyes set in a face of pale gold, the cut of her slender and elegant. Bearing a plaited bright and folded leather hat, she seemed almost like a huntress of story. A passing thought, almost absurd. No huntress out of a story would have been so intent on cutting her rations precisely that she ended up with leftover strength in slices of bread that she never actually ate. Then she snored, though the noise was amusingly dainty. "Words worth remembering," Song finally said. They left it at that. The inn they had walked past earlier was called The Last Rest. The words were carved above the door in scrabbly Antigua, the townsfolk apparently being unacquainted with the notion of hanging a sign. If not for the large and open shutters she would not have known the place for what it was from the outside. The ground floor was a common room full of long tables, with a fireplace at the back end of our counter. Behind that counter a door led into what looked like a kitchen, while a little to the side rickety stairs led to a second story. Song had gone across the street, where the town physician and gravediger, an efficient combination, Angharad had mused, was allegedly having a look at Young's wounds. Sorry would be waiting on him, as good a time as any to talk. The 3 souls she had been on the hunt for, however, were in the Last Rest common room. Having claimed the end of the table near the fireplace, they were sitting with warm meals and what appeared to be tankards of ale. Moving their way, Angharad noted that while Shalini appeared to have claimed one of Zenzel's sausages, she had in exchange surrendered her beer. Ferranda had traded nothing, but was poking at her peas with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. Angharad could not blame her, they were horribly common fare. It was Ferranda Vilazar who first saw her coming, and when Angharad gestured towards the open space by Zenzel's side with a raised eyebrow, the Infanzona gave a shrugging nod. Permission enough, the noblewoman decided. Loosening her sword belt, she pulled it off and set it down to the side before sliding onto the bench by Lord Zenzel. The man in question swallowed his drink, then smiled her way. "Lady Angharad," he said. "Come to get a meal out of them as well." "I would not mind," she admitted. "Is it expensive?" She did not have much coin left, and to be honest the thought of coin had her a little dazed. How long had it been since she last paid for something? Not even 2 weeks, and yet it felt like an entire world away. No cost. Angharad tensed at the voice coming from behind. She had not heard someone approach. Turning, she found a startlingly young man that could not have been older than 17 looking at her with mild boredom. He wore a leather apron over a rough-spun brown coat, a long-sleeved tunic in an antiquated style, and his messy black hair went down to his shoulders. He must have been Learganon, by the tan, but she could not place the accent. "As part of our charter with the watch," the man said, "we provide room and board for all trial takers as well as run the trial of weeds. You want a meal?" Angharad slowly nodded. "What is available?" "The meal," the Mandarli replied. "With or without beer?" "It is barley beer, Tredegar," Zenzel told her. Criminal stuff. It did not seem to hinder him any from getting started on the second drink. "Maize beer is a millennia obsession, Duma," she sadly replied. "My people make barley wine like civilized folk." "I'm sure you think you're interesting," the innkeeper said, sounding like they were anything but I'm still waiting on an answer. Angharad asked for a meal, without ale, then cleared her throat. "What is to be the arrangement for rooms?" she asked. "Usually we split your lot between here and the warm coffin across town, but there's barely any of you this year, so you're all going upstairs," the man said, jutting his thumb towards the stairway near the counter. Take whatever room you want, then come back and ask me for the key. There's numbers on the doors." "Thank you," Angharad nodded. The man snorted, then walked away. "I do not suppose the warm coffin's owner would be any more polite?" she dryly asked. "It's closed," Shalini got out after swallowing a large mouthful. Firanda asked when we heard about the meal. "He seems young to run an inn," Angharad said. "Even for a border town." "That we did not ask," Firanda replied. "Still, I would wager it had something to do with the cultists impaled before the gates. The entire town seems on edge. They might have been attacked recently." That made a great deal of sense, she thought. With the landslide burying the watch garrison near the mountain, the cult of the Red Eye might have thought it opportune to try a raid on Kentika. It would also explain how few people they had seen out on the streets. The innkeeper was back with her meal, sausage, peas and sliced almonds. She thanked the man, asking for his name, and got a raised eyebrow as only response. "Try the two," Zenzeldrali said. "Not the friendliest of fellows, this one." Shalini, who had polished off her entire plate and had begun eyeing that of her neighbors, let out a grunt. "He might not see the point in getting friendly when the trial could kill any of us," the Someshwari said. Firanda discreetly used her wooden fork to empty most of her peas onto Shalini's plate, smiling winningly at the other woman when Shalini turned to cock and eyebrow, but the grim mood brought on by the reminder of the trial of weeds was not so easily lifted. "It is a bloody affair," Angharad agreed. "And it now brings you to our shores so you might know who we will name," Lord Zenzel said. "That is of some import," she said, "but my greater concern is to ascertain where we will stop." Looks of surprise. "Barring a surprise or a miracle, Tupac Sikal will die come morning," Angharad said. "My question to you is this, will the trial end there?" The three traded looks, and again she felt a pang of envy at how closely they now kept. A few days ago they had been strangers. "I had thought," Zenzel slowly said, "that you would want a second round if only so that Lord Augusto might follow in Xikal's wake." Angharad shook her head. "I can do my own killing," she flatly replied. "I do not need a trial to do it for me." The oath she had given to Mayor Crespin was straightforward. She was to do no violence to trial takers or the townsfolk while a guest in Kentika, unless attacked first. The moment they stepped out of the town the Infanzon was no longer protected. "That is," Lady Firanda hesitantly said, "to your honor." "You're not the only one with grudges to settle, Tredegar," Shalini said. "Putting Tupac's head on spike hardly needs selling, and Augusto could do with getting his breathing rights revoked, but there's a murderer still on the loose and I will see her face justice." Angharad stilled. "Her?" she asked. "Your Etsi tried to murder Ishan on the way to the temple fortress," Shalini said. "You might not believe me, but I saw what I saw. I would have her put in a cage for it, then in a grave." "Do you have proof she murdered John and Ains?" Angharad asked. "No," Shalini admitted, "but how many vipers can there possibly be among us?" Firanda sighed. "I do not agree, and did not vote accordingly," the fair-haired woman said. "I am yet convinced that another was behind the deaths, acting through cat's paws. I have heard rumors about your Etsi, however, that are suspicious. Isabel had said that your Etsi was a foot shorter than she was supposed to be." Firanda did not seem to be putting strong stock in the other Infanzona's words, but neither was she dismissing them. Angharad cocked an eyebrow at Zenzel, leaving the question implied. "Looking back, I find some of her behavior during the trial of lines unusual," Zenzel admitted. "She was very used to roughing it, for a diplomat, and though she struck a friendship with Ayanda she showed little grief when the cultists took her." Shalini looked away at that. She and Ishan had refused to pursue the war band to take back Zenzel's lover, Angharad knew. It might have been the sounder call, but it seemed that a growing acquaintance with Zenzel Duma was shading the nuances of that decision in retrospect. "You were both committed to pursuing your Etsi's execution through a second round, then?" she asked. Shalini nodded briskly. Zenzel followed suit a heartbeat later. "There will be a death every round, and 3 of us in cages on every instance," she quietly reminded them. "You may not find the support you seek before a great many bodies have piled up." Firanda hummed. "A question best revisited tomorrow," she said. "Once Tupac is dead, we can decide how far this is to be pushed." Shalini looked mutinous, but she kept silent. By unspoken accord they turned to lighter talk as Angharad went through her meal, wolfing down the bland fare. Hunger was the finest spice. Others drifted in as she did, alone or in pairs. Cosm, freshly bandaged, came over to the table to share with them the news that Young was being cut open. He had a bullet in the back that must be removed, and might not be upright tomorrow. By the time Angharad finished her meal, the absences were more noticeable than those present. Besides Young, only 3 were missing: Tupac, Lan and Augusto. Parting ways with the 3, Angharad grabbed her saber and went upstairs to pick a room. The stairs led up to a tiny hallway forming a broad L, she found, whose longer length faced the street. Between the 2 sides there were around 20 doors with a number painted, and all were open save for the 3 nearest to the stairs. The Perdiri suspected these would be locked as well, but did not check. Instead she looked around for which room seemed most comfortable, hoping for a mattress that might not be stuffed straw. She was not the only one with such a notion. "Comparing the rooms, are we?" Brun asked, lips twitching into a smile. The blond Sacramentan looked tired, holding his back loosely, but was still steady on his feet. That tended to be the way with him. "Straw everywhere, so far," Angharad admitted. "Have you found anything?" "Same for the mattresses. I expect we should give up hope for that," he said. "No windows anywhere, but the 3 rooms in the corner have a dresser as well as a bedside table. That appears the pinnacle of luxury around here." Angharad sighed. It was better than nothing, she supposed. The 2 of them trudged back past the stairs, turning the corner of the L into the smaller length of hall. While she hesitated, Brun stole a march on her, claiming the middle of the 3 rooms and tossing his pack on the bed. Slightly irked, she walked past him and took the room at the very end of the hall. A 21 was painted in white on the door, the key she would need to claim. Brun was waiting for her in the hall when she came out. "Have you eaten yet?" he asked. She nodded. "Shame," Brun said. "Was it any good? Do you enjoy peas?" she dryly asked. "More than I enjoy starving," the fair-haired Manuma sadly replied. "Then I expect you will most adequately fed," Angharad told him. She could not bring herself to give a better compliment, as it would have been dangerously close to a lie. They made their way back down together, encountering Etsy going up as they did. Since the stairs were too narrow for 2, the Eastleigh gallantly went back down to give way, while Brun instead climbed back up to cede her passage in turn. Angharad thanked the other woman with a nod, but no more than that. Given the chances that Etsy was some kind of imposter, it was best to keep her distance. When she claimed her key from the innkeeper, a dark-haired woman in her 30s, her clothes as old-fashioned as the young man's, was waiting for her. "Alex," she introduced herself. "I handle Mayor Crespin's affairs. You're Angharad Tredegar, correct?" Angharad nodded confirmation. "I need 3 names from you, then," Alex said, picking up a chalk and slate. After a heartbeat of hesitation, she gave them. Tupac Sickle, Augusto Cherton and Cosmo Flor. After the first round and Tupac's death, Angharad saw no need to continue this vicious trial, but that was not in her power to decide. Perhaps talks could be had tomorrow, after the execution. After going back up to lock her door, when returning to the common room she found that Song was seated with Sare and a reluctant-seeming Firanda, something Angharad decided she wanted no part of. She took to the streets instead, feet itching to move for all her exhaustion. They would not be allowed to retire to their rooms until all had given 3 names anyhow. Kentika was smaller than she had thought. 2 lodgings, the last rest and the warm coffin, swallowed up quite a bit of the room inside the area walled in by the palisade and ring of lamplights. The rest was rough wooden houses, all their shutters were closed, and Angharad saw a precious few of the townsfolk out on the streets, and a handful of shops. The people of Kentika were polite but distant, most of them not even bothering to reply to a greeting beside a cart nod. The shops were not much to look at either. A half-empty general store and a smithy were nestled one against another, while further down the street a carpenter and a baker made up the rest of the town's main street. Angharade found Lang sitting in the alley by the bakery, perched on a crate as she tore into a loaf of black bread. On a whim, she sought out the other woman. "There are warm meals at the last rest, you know," Angharade said. The blue-lipped Tianxi smiled. "You can't move while eating those, though," she said. "And there's a lot to see in a place like this." Angharade cocked an eyebrow, somewhat skeptical. "Is there?" Lan hummed. "How many people do you think live in a town this size?" she asked. Angharade blinked. "Around 200 or 300, she guessed. "Probably closer to 4 or 5, Lan said. "But you're in the right area. How many of those people have you seen out in the streets?" Angharade thought back, slipping into a frown. "Fewer than 50, she said. "And no children." "Common sense to keep your kids indoors when you've got a dozen heavily armed lunatics on the prowl," Lan said, "but why so few people are out and about is what has me curious. I figure it's about the lights." The Perduri blinked, putting the pieces together. "You think Hollows live here?" she asked, appalled. "No," Lan said, biting into the bread and swallowing a chunk. "I think people live here, and they keep Hollow slaves. Do you know a lot of farmers who'd go out there and till a field when there's cultists on the loose? They are using expendables, is my guess. And the watch allows it, because if Kentucky's turning a profit they can get some tax money out of this place." Angharade swallowed. "And now that the lamplights are lit," she said, "the Hollows stay inside so the touch of the glare will not hurt them." The other woman nodded. "It's just a guess," Lan admitted. "But I find it mighty interesting there's hardly a house in this town where the shutters are open but that all the shops, the rich parts, the people with coin, are open and their owners around. It paints a picture." It did, Angharade thought with a grimace. The watch did not practice slavery, but Kentucky was not the rookery. It was a colony with a charter, and if the legalities were anything like those in Malin then this town would be something like a vassal state paying tribute. Not, strictly speaking, part of the watch or its territories. Would that at least one part of this misbegotten island was not filled to the brim with sinister secrets, Angharade bit out. Lan eyed her, seemingly amused. "Then you won't be interested in what I overheard keeping an eye on our friend Augusto," she teased. Angharade blinked. "Why were you following Augusto?" she slowly asked. "Because Tupac said he'd kill me and make it look like an accident," Lan cheerfully replied. "I lost him 2 streets over, near the butcher's shop." Angharade considered the other woman as she kept tearing into her loaf of bread, rather conflicted. On one hand, Lan was a sneak who looked into everyone's private affairs and riffled through their bags when given half an excuse. On the other hand, she was so open about this and her generally mercenary nature that Angharade could not quite bring herself to actually consider her a sneak. If a viper told you it was a viper and that it was going to bite you, then proceeded to bite you in the exact way it had informed you it would, could it really be considered treachery? Angharade cleared her throat. "Please," she said, "may I hear what Augusto was doing?" If the other woman had brought it up, it would be worth hearing. "Free of charge, since you're a good sort," Lan easily said. "Our boy was talking with the town guards earlier, asking about the gates of Kentucky. More precisely whether there are other ways in or out of this place." Angharade's eyes narrowed. "Are there?" "I didn't hear the guards answer," Lan said. "But I think his lordship has seen the writing on the wall for the trial of weeds, and now he wants to pull a runner before he ends up losing his head." That was, Angharade darkly thought, despicably plausible of the man. "Perhaps I should have a look at where he is, then," she flatly said. "Good luck with that," Lan said, biting into the bread. "And I mean it. You can smell the crazy on that boy, and it's not even the entertaining kind." Not quite sure how to answer that, the noblewoman kept her face blank and offered her most polite goodbyes. Lan only seemed all the more amused, though her eyes were already far away. The Tianxi was not done sniffing around Kentucky for secrets, Angharade could tell. She did not find Augusto in time. The Infanzon had made himself scarce, and Tupac was no longer by the butcher shop when she passed close. In truth, she did not have long to look around, as a town guard accosted her in the street and told her to return to the last rest. May I ask why? Angharad politely said. The votes are all in, the woman replied. The names and numbers are on the slate by the door. Once everyone has seen them, you'll all be allowed to turn in for the night. Though Angharad believed she already knew the results, she supposed there was no harm in taking a look before going on the hunt for Augusto again. Besides, it might be interesting to see the numbers. She thanked the guard and briskly made her way back, finding most of their company out in the street and looking at a slate 6 feet high. The writing was the same as that of the mayor's helper, Alex, was it? Angharad stepped around Zenzel to come closer to the slate, noticing from the corner of her eye that Song was there and looking worried. Why? Her look at the slate revealed that 11 out of the 14 of them had named Tupac, putting him at the top of the list. It was, in truth, fewer than she had expected. Augusto was second and had been named 10 times, which seemed reasonable to her. Cosme's name was the third, she saw, but there she blinked. 5 times. He had only been named 5 times. And the name under his was a scrawled Angharad with a 4 besides it. She had come within 1 vote of ending up in a cage, the Perduri dimly realized. All this time speaking with others and never even noticed she was resting on the knife's edge. Under her Tristan had been named 4 times as well, another injustice, and then of all people Brun had been thrice named. Your Etsy being named thrice was slightly less startling, but it came as a blindside that the last name on the list would be Song, named twice. Perhaps Angharad should have tried to match votes to faces, to piece it all together, but her eyes kept returning to her name right under Cosme's and how close she had come to being sent into the cage in his stead. Feeling stares lingering on her back, the Perduri flushed in embarrassment. 4 votes, sleeping god. Augusto and Tupac she could understand, but who else had she offended to deserve such a slight? Was Cosme two-faced enough to ask for her mercy and in the same breath try to have her encaged? The Perduri's jaw clenched. He likely was. And it still left one more among the 14 who had wanted her put on display like a wild animal, having never said a word to her face. Her mood significantly fouled, she ignored Song calling out for her and strode away. Absence of company would do her well. A minute or two of walking around with enough of a scowl that the townsfolk gave her a wide berth calmed her down, enough that when she caught sight of a familiar silhouette she did not avoid him. Tristan, after all, also had 4 votes to his name. She did not believe him any more deserving of such slander than she. The scruffy man was leaning against the side of a house, Angharad saw as she approached, and looking up at one of the pale lamplights that ringed the entire town of Kentika to keep away lemurs and strike fear in the hearts of darklings. The man flicked a glance her away as she came near, offering a polite nod that she returned. "Missing home?" she asked. It must have been quite the change, leaving Sacramonte for the first time. "There's fewer lights in my parts of the city than you'd think," Tristan replied. "But there is something nostalgic about this, I'll admit." His lips thinned. "These are the exact same kind of lamplights they use in the murk." Angharad had not been long in Sacramonte, but long enough to hear of this murk. The city's slums, though there were wild and colorful rumors about what went on there. She cocked an eyebrow at the man, for this did not seem a detail worth staring at. "I imagine they must import them from Sacramonte," Angharad said. "It is the closest city to the island and the watch has ancient ties to it." "I figured that as well," Tristan agreed. "Only, Tredegar, those lamplights are in pristine state. Their glow is perfect." "And what does that mean?" Angharad asked. "Either nothing at all," Tristan quietly said, "or that we are in very serious trouble." Chapter 41. It was a small mark, barely the width of half a palm, but that C/C single quote might just get them all killed. "Trouble?" Lady Angharad Tredegar slowly repeated. "What do you mean?" Tristan saw the change in the noblewoman, the way her previous sulk immediately turned into a straightened back as she unconsciously made enough room to be able to draw her saber. It was interesting that someone of her birth had learned such a habit, the kind you usually saw in leg breakers and killers who had been in the service of coteries for years, who knew death might come for them at any moment. Someone had tried to kill Angharad Tredegar, he figured, and taken more than one swing at it. The thief cleared his throat. "Would you like the short explanation or the long?" he asked. The Perduri blinked, as if surprised he would even ask. "The long, of course," Angharade seriously said. "Huh?" Fortuna mused, cocking her head to the side. "No one ever asks for the long explanation. I think something might be wrong with her, Tristan." "A bit. I mean, she just willingly signed up for you talking more to her. She must be a masochist at the very least." It was not possible to strangle an incorporeal goddess, Tristan knew. He had tried enough to be certain. Hiding his surprise, Fortuna wasn't wrong about the first part at least. The thief cleared his throat again, placing his thoughts in order. "A lamplight is not a complicated thing to make," he finally said. "In essence, it is an iron post about 20 feet high, broader at the base, for stability, with a cylinder of brass and iron screwed on atop it. There is an oil reservoir inside and a wick to light." Tredegar was, by all appearances, listening quite attentively, as if interested. It began to occur to him that Fortuna might actually be a right, an unsettling prospect at the best of times. "The oil itself is cheap," he said. "Almond oil, but they do not need to be glare-grown, just cut with infused dust or stone. Iron is cheap in Sacramonte because of the trench, and an iron post is not complicated to forge, so lamplights are relatively cheap to make and have been for as long as anyone can remember. It is not a popular good to trade in because there is, as far as anyone can tell, no coin to make in it." "But," Angharade said, "Milani nobles were said to have a better eye for coins than most," he recalled. "Or at least their lesser branches." "Enter Chabir Kalanti," Tristan said, "to whom the very Prince of Lies is favorably compared in some parts of the Merc." The Perduri's brown eyes moved to the lamplight by which they stood, finding the C/C single quote impressed into the metal. Her brow rose. "Decades have passed since then and tales have eaten away at the truth of the matter," Tristan continued, "but some elements always remain. Chabir Kalanti was a trader, a Trebian merchantman, and by way of what he believed to be an opportunity came into a large number of pili cannons, the barrels, to be precise." Angharade cocked her head to the side. "I have read of those," she said. "Tianxi artillery. Powerful but infamously imprecise. Their use cost the Republic several engagements at sea." "I doubt the man would have cared," Tristan said. "But he was tricked anyhow. The reason he got the barrels so cheaply was because they had been miscast. Some sort of thinned junction, it made the bottoms prone to exploding after the second shot. Even worse, the Republic he meant to sell these to averted war by way of treaty at the last moment. So he was ruined," Tredegar said. She sounded rather approving. "Most would have been, but Chabir Kalanti was bold," Tristan replied. "Around that time, the city was looking to expand its lines of lamplights into the Merc. Chabir had a stroke of inspiration. By sticking the miscast barrels atop a shorter, hollow base of scrap iron, he would be able to build lamplights for a pittance. Surely the quality would be greatly lessened." Angharade frowned. Tristan shrugged. "The story goes that when the contract bids were made to the infant zones, his offered price was almost half that of his competitors," the thief said. Chabir's description of his shorter, squat lamplights as built hardened against the savagery of the commons was allegedly found rather charming. They awarded him the contract. The noblewoman's face hardened. "This borders on corruption," she severely said. "It is, at the very least, incompetence." Tristan wondered what it must be like, to live in a world where either of these things were a real hindrance in holding on to power you were born to. Lamplights with that newly minted mark of C/C single quote sprouted over about half the Merc the following year, Tristan said. "All of Solianti, Arturo and Carrar. I do not know these districts," Angharade told him. "I was lodged in Cortolo and spent some time in Fishmonger's Quay." Tristan let out a little noise of curiosity. "Cortolo is one of the nicer parts of the old town," he said. "I'm surprised you were able to get a bed there. Most foreigners end up near the ports." "My uncle recommended an acquaintance," Angharade said. "Ah, the Blascloak relation. More likely he had recommended an inn with ties to the watch," Tristan thought. They are districts near the western edge of the city, he said. Far from Cortolo, and indeed the eyes of the Infanzones. Chabir Kalanti became very rich from this deal, a man of means, but as the months turned into a year word began trickling in, his lamplights kept blowing up, the top exploding in showers of fire and broken glass. Angaharade's lips thinned. She was, Tristan realized, genuinely angry at the thought of something that had happened in a foreign land decades before she was born. It was the parts from the Pili cannons, Tristan said. Constant heat warped them, and by doing so turned them into makeshift grenades that blew the top off their own lamplights. What happened after Chabir Kalanti was arrested? Tredegar asked. He wasn't, Tristan mildly said. Chabir suppressed news a few more years by paying a coterie to frame another for the explosions, which kept him in good odor long enough to marry into a noble house and prepare. Prepare how? The Perduri said, sounding baffled. By the time it came out, his lamplights were essentially a self-inflicted bombardment of Sacramontan streets, Tristan said. He had replacements lined up for the pieces whose manufacture just so happened to enrich enough powerful Infanzones that not only did he go unpunished, he actually grew richer. Angharate Tredegar looked as if she had just been slapped, something that took great effort not to smile at. He could not help it, she was taking it all so personally. He should have been hanged, the noblewoman stiffly said. And all involved in awarding him the contract stripped of their offices and titles in public disgrace. You don't even notice it, do you? That even in your finer world, you would hang the commoner and let the nobles get away with a slap on the wrist. Tristan could not find it in him to be irked over it. It was the kind of blindness you were born into, as much a defect as a limp or a stutter. Tredegar looked slightly embarrassed by her own outburst, coughing awkwardly. This lamplight is one of the repaired pieces, then? She asked. Tristan grimaced. For now they got to the bone of it. Chabir's name would not still be cursed for his trick after decades past had it ended there, he said. The replacement pieces, you see, did not work all that well either. The glow of the lamplights tends to wax and wane, and some trouble with the wicks means they can go dark for hours at a time without warning. Tredegar was not a slow woman, for all her self-inflicted fettering. You said earlier that the glow of these lamplights is perfect. Tredegar slowly said. It is not the same as those you know, then? No, he grimly said. It is not. The upper half does not look quite the same either, the mark is in a different place. He grimaced. I think, Tristan said, that we are looking at the original cast. Chabir's first batch. And you said that within a year these pieces exploded, Tredegar quietly said. Those in the Merc were used every day? He nodded. Then even if the people of Kentucky like these only the necessary amount to prevent gloam disease, they should have broken by now, Tredegar stated, and he was surprised by the certainty in her voice. Ah, he should not have. Her mother had been some sort of explorer, hadn't she? No one knew gloam disease better than those who ventured out into the dark seas. There could be other explanations, he warned. If the town has only existed for a year or two, for example, it would not have become the crux of the trial of weeds were it so recent a creation, Tredegar noted. Nor would it have so many established trades on the main street. A fair point, he thought as she paused. Though I suppose they could have private sources of glare light, she said. Within their own homes. It might be that the use of the lamplights is restricted to the trial of weeds. The lamplights are half of what keeps out cultists and lemures, Tristan disagreed. The watch does not seem to be protecting Kentucky from raids, by the corpses out front, so they would have used them defensively at least. Besides, think of the cost. Every single family in a small town like this having a private light? It would represent a fortune in coin. And Kentucky did not seem like a wealthy town. I have no notion of the costs involved, Tredegar admitted. Much of Peretta is covered by glare light from the pit above. It'd be cheaper near a pit, like your home or Sacramonte, Tristan said, but it would be quite expensive out here on a nowhere island, where all is imported. I doubt even the watch garrisons on the Dominion have such luxury. Then the people of Kentucky ought to be darklings by now, and they are not, the Perduri said, her voice gone flinty. They are hiding something from us. It was interesting to witness it, the exact moment when white turned to black in Angharad Tredegar's mind. Before then the townsfolk had been their hosts, honorable souls deserving of every courtesy. Now they were schemers, looming threats. It would have been easy to mock the woman for it, call it simplicity, but Tristan had seen naivete and this was not it. It was trained mindset, something she had been taught. Would it not be a useful skill to a noble, being able to decide in a heartbeat that one of your formerly esteemed peers was a hateful foe without taking the betrayal personally? He was coming around to thinking that Angharad Tredegar was a lot like a thoroughbred trained for the races. Splendid at what she was meant to do, sorting people and being mannerly, but somewhat at a loss outside these bounds. Which was only natural. Using a racer like a mountain mule was a good way to scrap that very expensive horse. Besides, Tredegar would not be at a loss forever. She was not without cleverness. Given time to find her footing she should turn into a singularly dangerous woman. But for now she was merely very dangerous, so the thief intended to find her a racing course to put that danger to use. What to say, what to hide, what to leverage. Tristan sketched out the angles, then made his decision. This cannot be spread around blindly, Tristan told her. Some would panic and tip off the townsfolk we are onto them. If we are in danger, Tredegar said, we must warn the others. The thief feigned hesitation, preparing to concede down to the compromise he had wanted from the start. Only those we both agree on, he offered. After a heartbeat of hesitation Tredegar nodded. It would serve, given the millennia obsession with keeping their word. We need to find out what they are hiding, the noblewoman said. What kind of dark pact has kept them from becoming hollows without glare light? I have a guess as to what might be going on, Tristan said. But considering who I believe has the answers, I will need your help. Tredegar cocked an eyebrow. My help? She skeptically asked. He nodded. We need to find Tupac, Tristan said. He despises me, the noblewoman informed him. An entirely mutual feeling, I assure you. The thief doubted that, in fact, at least on the Eascles side, but now was not the time for that talk. Or ever, really. It doesn't matter, Tristan said. Tupac Sickle is not going to answer any question I ask him, because he and I both know that if I press him he will savagely beat me and dump my unconscious body somewhere humiliating. Tredegar opened her mouth and then closed it, speechless. You, on the other hand, Tristan continued, can savagely beat him should he attempt this, which he is equally aware of. That capacity is the required foundation for having any kind of halfway polite conversation with Tupac Sickle. The noblewoman squinted at him. Tristan, she said, are you attempting to use me as some sort of street tough? That was absolutely what he was attempting to do, yes. Outright lying to the woman whose entire way of life was bound to the concept of honor seemed a mistake, so he decided on a different angle. Be a pal, Tristan tried. Do it for justice. A heartbeat passed. I am not sure whether I should be offended at the implication, Tredegar muttered, or relieved that someone is finally asking of me something I know for certain I can do. That uncertainty, he sagely advised, is the garden where friendships bloom. Angharad did not stab him for that, which was good as agreement in his book. Tupac Sickle, spear assembled and at the ready, loomed over them from the rooftop. The pale-eyed Eastley was perched at the edge of the tiles, surveying the streets of Kentucky like a hunting cat waiting for the right prey to pounce. Tupac was bound for the cages and likely the grave unless he found the secret that would spare his life, so it hardly surprised Tristan that the man had decided trying to rustle up votes was a waste of time better spent on getting the lay of the land in Kentucky. Indeed, the thief was counting on it. Everyone else, including him, had dabbled elsewhere. Good evening, Tristan cheerfully called out. The Eastley sneered down. Less so now that you waste part of it, he said. Run along, rat. A full 2 seconds passed. Lady Tredegar, Tupac greeted with a nod. It was almost impressive how excruciatingly deliberate he had made that pause. Your manners are lacking as ever, Tredegar frostily replied. They match the soul they are offered to, Tupac drawled. Insult and compliment all at once, Tristan thought to Mussedley. How crafty. "We ask only for a conversation," the thief said. "We?" The Eastleigh snorted. "How the mighty have fallen, Tredegar. Are you now cowering away in fear of the dark with this one?" Angharad Tredegar cocked her head to the side. "Shall we?" she mildly said. "Speak of fear, then, Tupac Sickle." The eerily perfect man went still, a statue of flesh and blood, and Tristan hid his surprise. Tredegar had something on the man, she must have for him to react this way. How? Nobody had something on Tupac. The Leopard Society man was like a pile of razor blades fashioned into a man's shape. Tupac leapt down from the roof, landing in a smooth crouch that was just close enough to force Tristan to take a step back, but the thief hardly even cared. This was just too delicious. That Angharad Tredegar, of all people, would come into the power to hold Tupac's feet to the fire was enough to make his day. "Do not waste my time," Tupac said. "What do you want?" Tredegar cleared her throat, turning her gaze to Tristan. This had gone remarkably quickly, the thief mused, and he had not had to suffer nearly as many condescending threats against his life as he had been expecting. Angharad was already proving a remarkably useful stick to shake at people. "To trade in secrets," Tristan said. "You have been looking over Kentucky for hours now, Sickle. Where is it?" The noblewoman at his side frowned. "Where's what?" Tupac snorted. "The place where the bodies are buried," the Eastleigh said. "Where our beloved hosts are keeping their dirty little secrets." Tristan cocked an eyebrow. "And?" "On the right side of town, near the palisade, they keep large piles of lumber for firewood," Tupac said. "Only the wood is old while the tracks that come and go in the mud are fresh. So an underground cellar, most likely," the thief mused. "They are keeping something down there." Tredegar looked uncomfortable. "I have been told," she hesitantly said, "that Kentucky might be keeping darkling slaves. If such a cellar exists, it might be a jail of sorts for the disobedient." Tristan stilled for a moment, fitting the pieces. If his growing guess about what the people of Kentucky actually were proved true, then it was only sensible that hollow slaves would be kept around to work the fields and do the busy work. He had thought that the streets were empty because the townsfolk were keeping away from the trials, but glare lamplights would force hollows off the streets. "That would be a boon," Tupac said. "Tortured slaves always tell on the masters when given the opportunity, hollows most of all." Tredegar, he saw, was struggling between a polite dislike of slavery and her inability to approve of a slave turning on their lawful superior. "Time to have a look at our cellar, then," Tristan said, rolling a shoulder. "Trade means I get something as well, rat," Tupac said. The thief nodded. "Your question?" "No question," Tupac said. "I am coming with you, that is my price." "No," Tredegar immediately denied. Tristan said nothing, which after a heartbeat earned him a glare and a reproachful Tristan from the swordswoman. Mentioning that Tupac seemed like a splendid scapegoat should anything go wrong with their little trip was unlikely to sway Tredegar, so instead Tristan tried a different approach. "Why do you want to come?" he asked Tupac. "You could easily trade for us telling you what we learn afterwards instead." The Eastleigh's pale eyes narrowed, a grudging look seizing his face. Tupac recognized the offered branch for what it was, a way to talk himself into coming along, but resented being given at all anything by the likes of Tristan. This was turning, the thief mused, into a most satisfying interlude. "Squirm some more," he thought, smiling pleasantly at the other man. "This trial," Tupac said. "There is something wrong about it." "There is nothing wrong about being called to account for your own deeds," Tredegar bit back. He dismissed that with an irritated gesture. "I mean in the way it is done," the Eastleigh said. "What prevents any group with half the votes from killing off everyone they dislike regardless of the stated purpose of this trial? It is supposed to weed out the unworthy, but it is too easy to rig, even with a way to get out of being killed." "Ah," Tristan exhaled. "You think there is something out to kills us beyond each other?" "We are forbidden from fighting each other and the townsfolk," Tupac said. "But what if there was something else inside the walls with us? Something that could walk under the light of the glare, something that would not reveal itself before it struck." Tristan had slowly but surely come to the same conclusion, but on a larger scale than Tupac was considering. The Easkey was yet thinking of this as a hunt when he should have thought of it as a racket. Attacks in the night would punish us for lingering too long, Tredegar quietly said. Force us to balance the righteousness of executing the deserving and the risks we incur to the innocent in doing so. Something the Blaskloaks would be most interested in learning about their company before welcoming them into its ranks is the hidden rule that hunting the killer during the night gets you spared. It would be a way to preserve talent that had burned too many bridges but might still be useful to the watch. A rule to preserve the likes of Tupac Sickle, in other words. I want answers, same as you, but that is not why I want to go with you, Tupac said. It occurs to me that my foe might just be tempted into an attack should it look like we are about to uncover Kentika's secrets. Tredegar breathed out. That is what you have been doing, she said. Standing alone in an attempt to bait them out. Ah, Tristan thought. The blinders went both ways. He saw the affairs as a racket, so it had not occurred to him that Tupac might be trying to outfox a hunter. It was good Tredegar had caught it, for it finally allowed him to understand what exactly it was the Easkey had been doing all this time. He will coming along whether we like it or not, Tristan told Angharad. He is dead if he does not find the hidden rule. There is nothing we can do that will be worse than the outcome should he miss that opportunity. The noblewoman stared at him for a long moment, face reluctant, but he did not blink. Tredegar sighed. Though you will be accompanying us, she flatly told Tupac, you will not be of our company. An important distinction to her, he expected. Perhaps she would not be bound to offer him aid in battle if he was not a companion. You're hurting my feelings, Lady Tredegar, the Easkey grinned. Count your blessings that an oath prevents me from hurting anything more than that, Sickle, she bit back. And without another word she walked away, leaving the two of them standing face to face. Looking for fresh coattails to ride, Tristan? Tupac idly asked. Young seems to have finally shaken you off of his. I am going to find out what she has on you, Tupac, Tristan affably replied, and walk around this town shouting it at the top of my lungs. With the proper courtesies now observed, they hurried to catch up to Tredegar. The piles of lumber were exactly as they had been told, large, old and much too frequently visited to truly be what they pretended to be. The three were careful to avoid walking in the mud and leave tracks, rather, he and Tupac were and Tredegar observed the same route without asking why, as they approached. The place was deserted, likely to avoid drawing attention in the first place, but they avoided staying out in the open anyhow. The faster they were done here the better. Though they swept around looking for the expected lookout, none was there to be found. We are taking too long, Tupac grunted. Best we start looking for that cellar. The part where the lumber was stacked was dry ground, so tracks were not so easily found, but after they began going around testing them Tredegar soon let out a noise of surprise. Her stack was easily moved, lifted one-handed, and though the Perduri was a strong woman she was not that strong. It was hollow, glued together, and there was a trapdoor beneath. Promising, Tristan said. They moved aside the false pile. Tupac tried to prevent it from being too obvious they had moved it from a distance, but Tristan suspected that was a lost cause. Secrecy would only be had by speed. Pulling at an iron ring, Tredegar opened the door and revealed a lightless stone chamber below. Tristan knelt at the edge, peering down, and frowned. The stink of human filth was strong, but he saw little aside from bare stone. We will have to go down, he said. I do not suppose either of you has a lantern? Matches, Tupac replied. It would have to do. There was a small makeshift ladder leading down and down they went one after another, the Easkey taking the lead. Once Tredegar closed the trapdoor over their heads, Tupac scratched a match. Flickering light revealed the boundaries of the small chamber they were in, stone on all sides except one, where instead a door of thick iron bars faced them. You were right, Tristan murmured to Angharad. It is a jail. There was a padlock on the door, the same kind as the cages in the town square, and as they got close the match guttered out. Tupac scratched another, revealing a dozen darklings laying down on the floor covered by filthy straw and dust. Most were half naked, all bruised and several looked like they had been cut or clawed at. Tredegar went stiff with outrage. Tupac remaining unbothered. Tristan instead studied the prisoners inside, finding that most were either asleep or unconscious. One woman in rags was looking at them with white eyes. Blue eyes, he saw, and the sight of that with pale skin had his belly clenching with something unpleasant. "You're not them," the woman rasped out in accented Antigua. "The townsfolk of Kentucky," Tristan said. "They are the ones who put you here?" She feebly nodded. "Masters," she said. "I took more rations, for my brother, and they said I am a thief. Put me here." "You are a slave, then," Tupac said. His voice was soft, almost gentle. His match died and he struck another, revealing that his pale eyes were as cold as they'd ever been. A leopard society man at work, the thief thought. "All slaves," the woman said. "We work fields. Cut wood. Serve the lamplights," Tristan said. "How often are they lit?" The woman coughed, rasped out that she did not understand. Tredegar's face was a painting of anguish. Tupac spoke a few words in a language Tristan did not know, a Holocant, and then repeated the second part of the thief's question. "Once a year," the woman said. "A few days." She coughed again. "Can you," she began, licking her lips. "Can you let me out?" "As soon as we have the key," Tupac lied without batting an eye. "Do you know why the townsfolk have not become like you? Why they are still of the glare?" The slave shook her head, then hesitated. "This place," she said. "Those who come here do not come back. Maybe this. Please, won't you let me out?" Pity was never any help, Tristan knew. It was best set aside. There are stories of Triglav tribesmen sacrificing men to gods so they might avoid going hollow, Angharade quietly said. He traded a skeptical look with Easley before the match went out. Another scratched into life. Mullaney sailors had many a wild tale about the folks of their far-flung territories, always spoken of as the tale told them, of course, to avoid lying. The town might have something like a candle, Tupac said. It would not support many without regular blooding, but that might explain why we have seen so few townsfolk. We have seen few townsfolk, Tristan thought, because this is not a town. Not any more than this jail is a jail. It is, in truth, a larder. "We need to leave," the thief said. "We have been down here too long and she has nothing more to tell us." Tupac nodded. Tredegar looked torn, but there was a reason the Perdiri had said precious little since coming down here. She knew she was in no place to make promises. "Please," the woman rasped, crawling their way. "Please?" Tristan wrenched his gaze away. Tupac was the last one up, as he had to keep scratching matches, and that was a mercy. He was the only one of them those horse pleas were not making flinch. Tristan had half expected an ambush the moment they were back to standing among the lumber piles, but there was not a soul in sight. Not even a rat. The thief hummed, trying to remember if he had seen any animal at all since coming to Kentucky. Not one, he thought. Not a single cat or dog, much less a rat. There would be cattle somewhere, for there was a butcher's shop near the main street, but the lack of anything else was telling. It went on the tally, along with the way the townsfolk never showed their teeth when smiling and kept conversations short, when they could not avoid talking entirely. "We should split up," Tristan suggested. "If we stay together people will ask where we have been." Tupac gave no argument, as was only to be expected. Half the reason the Easley had come was because he'd wanted to be attacked. He would not insist on sticking together. Tredegar hesitated, still shaken by what she had seen below, but nodded after a moment. "Let us meet again at the last rest," she told him. "We must talk." Tupac snorted dismissively at them and stalked away, disappearing into the bowels of the town. Tristan nodded his agreement at the noblewoman, then invited her to head out first. He waited until she had turned the corner to follow suit, every second growing tenser. He was the easiest prey of the three, he knew, and if someone was lying in wait. Only when he sped away from the hidden cellar after having put the hollow pile back in place there was no sudden attack. There was, indeed, no trace of anyone at all until he was close to the main street again. There he ran into a couple out on a walk, the both of them silently nodding back when he gave a cheerful greeting. "Not a chatty folk, are they?" He almost leapt out of his skin. Mariam was sitting on a small bench by the side of the road, tucked away into a slice of shadow as she looked on. He had missed her entirely, which did nothing for his nerves. "Come," he told himself. "You have already discovered part of the trap." "That they are not," he said. She moved over to make room for him when he approached, sitting by her side almost close enough to touch. Tristan hesitated a bit, then bit the blade. "How is he?" Mariam grimaced. "His chances are half and half, the physician says," she replied. Tristan grimaced back. Not only because Young's life was now a coin flip, but also because he was no longer certain that the physician could be trusted to speak the truth in the first place. "We have trouble," Tristan said. Blue eyes narrowed at him. He swallowed, remembering the pleas that had followed them up the ladder before trailing off into a ragged silence just as heartbreaking. "Once, just once, I would like to have a light-hearted conversation with you," Mariam demanded. "How goes it, Mariam? Lovely weather we're having, isn't it?" "Delightful," he replied, unable to follow her mood. "Cloudy with a chance of devils, you might say." She stilled. All humor stolen right out of her. "Inside the walls?" Mariam whispered, leaning closer. "I think every single person we've talked to since arriving in Kentucky has been a devil," Tristan said, and it was almost a relief to finally say it out loud. "They all smile without showing their teeth, and many of them avoid actually talking. Not all devils were skilled at mimicking voices, their kind growing more adept at deception as they aged. It's the eyes that give them away, usually," Mariam contested. It was. Eyes were fragile, especially when you emptied out the body behind them to wear it over your misbegotten form, so they tended to dry out or rip. In modern times devils were said to wear spectacles over them to hide the detail, but half of Kentucky wearing these would have been a dead giveaway. "I was taught to check the teeth," Tristan replied. "The careful ones keep the human teeth, but if you look deep enough you can see their own creeping up behind." He had never seen the true body of a devil with his own eyes, though he had seen diagrams in books. Something neither quite crustacean nor insectal but every inch a nightmare, all chitin and pincers. They had to fold themselves very carefully to fit inside a carcass, and should they lose their temper they were apt to rip through the fragile shell, allowing them to walk around under glare light. Mariam shivered. If the Watch allowed them to settle here, they should be signatories of the Iscariot Accords, she said. Relatively few things had been asked of Hell's regents, when peace was made and the Accords signed. The two large concessions had been the sealing of Pandemonium, the birthplace of devils, and that their kind would cease to eat humans and wear their skin. Modern devils, those that some nations allowed within their borders, wore skin taken from corpses. Fresh corpses, so the shell had not decayed, but they took only from the already dead. The devils here should not be meaning to eat them, Mariam meant. "I'm guessing they eat whichever poor bastard in the cage gets picked to die," Tristan mildly said. "They would need the bodies to replace the shells that rot or get torn, anyhow." Shalini had been promised that Ishan would get burned, but he now had some doubts. More likely something would get burnt, and next year Ishanir would be one of the faces greeting whoever made it to the trial of weeds. "The man running the last rest is very young," Mariam said after a moment. "Doesn't even look 20. If that was a choice made because they only have so many shells to pick from, then they are not given free rein to devour us at will," Tristan slowly finished. "That is something, at least. But not much. We need a way out of this place if it all goes to, well, you know," she embarrassedly finished. "Hell," he embarrassedly realized she had been going to say. "I expect there is more than a single way out of this place," he said. "A town of this size cannot do with a single gate." She nodded. "Find it," Mariam said. "I need to warn someone meanwhile." Songren, he thought. "I am to meet with Trudiger at the last rest in a while," he said. "To discuss plans." "I will be there," Mariam said. "And see if you can find Lan before joining us, she was looking for you earlier." It was his turn to nod. Lan had sharp eyes. He would not be surprised if she had noticed something stank about Kentucky. And someone had warned Trudiger about the likely slavery, hadn't they? That rather sounded like the dealer buying herself a friendly mirror dancer. Tristan suddenly hesitated, Mariam cocking an eyebrow. "Out with it," she asked. "There are slaves here," he said. "I found an underground jail with Tredegar and Tupac. It is how I put the last details together. That the prisoners in that jail never returned because the devils ate them." Mariam sighed, passing a hand through her hair. "There are slaves in many places, Tristan," she said. "My own father kept several. You need not tread so lightly about it." Tristan almost told her she would not say as much if she had seen how the slaves in a jail were treated, but he bit his tongue. Mariam had seen more of Vesper than he had. They had never said as much, but they both knew this. She knew full well the ugliness of slavery. It had been him that was unprepared. It was one thing to know of the hollows in the trench, how they were treated no better than beasts of burdens, but another to see such a thing with his own eyes. "It is a foul thing," he finally said, exhausted. "And fouler yet when made into a trade," Mariam softly agreed. Neither said any more than that. Lan was hanging around the slate where all the names and numbers had been written in chalk, staring at them in what Tristan suspected was an attempt at figuring out who had tried to put who in a cage. The thief himself was rather curious who had named him, but he had significantly larger swords hanging above his head at the moment. "Tristan," his fellow rat greeted him without turning. "What have you been up to, I wonder?" Seeing the sights, he drawled. "You?" Lan eyed their surroundings. No one was all that close, most the others inside the last rest to eat or drink, but the shutters were open and sound might carry. She gestured for him to follow, the two of them moving into the alley to the side of the inn. "Bron is up to something," she said, lowering her voice. "And I think your Etsy is part of it." The thief eyed her. "I'm listening," he said. "They are always talking," she said. "And they have the two rooms besides Tredegar's." "He has no reason to go after Tredegar," Tristan pointed out. "Not only would she promptly kill him for it, she has a high opinion of the man and people listen to her." "Maybe it's about your Etsy, then," Lan impatiently said. "They're up to something, Tristan." The thief grimaced. "I still believe Bron is the killer," he finally said. "No one else fits. But I think I might have been more certain in the moment than was truly warranted, Lan." She eyed him coldly. "You don't really think that," the blue-lipped woman said. "You just think this is too much trouble to deal with on top of whatever you disappeared to sniff out." That was, he silently conceded, not entirely unfair of her to say. It certainly weighed on the scales. Bron was something to deal with when the threat of devils was no longer hanging over their heads. But it was not a lie either to say that he had thought twice since threatening the other rat. Even if he was out to kill someone again, Tristan said, why would your Etsy help him? Lan hesitated. What else would they be doing? An alliance, for fear of ending up in a cage, he said. Or dead. The thief shook his head. Bring me more, Tristan said, and it could be acted on. But you don't have enough, Lan. And however sharp her eyes, he thought, wanting her twins killer dead was not like to keep them clear. Lan licked her lips, the blue on her tongue faded darker, and scoffed. She stalked away angrily, but they both knew that for the concession it was. Tristan watched her go and sighed. He had a gate to find. To his utter lack of surprise, when Tristan slid into a seat across the table from Enharade Tredegar, her minder was at her side. Song studied him calmly with those unblinking silver eyes, weighing and taking his measure. The thief wondered if Mariam, who was sitting on his side of the table, was to be taken as his minder. There might even be a grain of truth to that. We must decide on what we tell others, Songran evenly said. And do it soon, as people have already begun to retire to their rooms. Tristan glanced at Mariam, wondering exactly how much of their own path to Kentika she had told her. Colleague, accomplice? The relationship there was still nebulous. That we have reason to expect that there will be an attack in the night, Tristan suggested. And then the idea came to him, quick and silver bright and so utterly tempting he could not resist. And that we should be ready to retreat from the last rest if trouble finds us, he added. Tredegar's brow rose. You believe the night attack will be so dangerous? He's right, Mariam said. It could be a god they made a bargain with or a pack of devils, we cannot know. What we do know is that the watch expects that attack to be capable of taking on fighters sharp enough to make it through the first 2 trials. I would prefer to stand our ground, Angharad admitted, but some of us are not fighters, so I'll not deny it might be wiser to retreat and draw the enemy onto better grounds. And there was the shape of his opportunity. Dozens moving around at night, with violence and chaos afoot. We should pick 2 different locations for folk to gather at, the thief casually said. If we get dispersed, or are pursued, it might not be easy to gather in a single place or wait for everyone. I found a postern gate on the side of town, that can be one location. The front gate for the other. That seems wise, Tredegar nodded. Silver eyes on him, but he did not flinch. Miriam would not have told her, he chose to believe that. Gods, how could he not when she has lost fingers to save his life? Each of us can head to one such place should the worst come, Tristan said. I imagined I should take the side gate, since I am the one who found it. A shrug, the Perdiri agreeing. And now we tell the others, Tredegar breathed out. She seemed tired, at long last. It would be best to split that duty up, each of us talk to only a few, Tristan said. Our hosts might notice something is happening otherwise. It was only sensible, so naturally they agreed, and he ignored the weight of Sung's piercing silver eyes as he rose. I need a favor, he whispered to Miriam. He got something like a smile, cold and entirely savage. I thought you might, she said. I'll take care of it. Tristan did not begin with him, that would have been too obvious. He did not need to rush anyway, as Tredegar was now on poor terms with the man and so unlikely to approach. As for Song, well, Miriam just happened to want a word with her at that moment. Cosmo Flora was third on his list and already eyeing him warily by the time he sat across the man. The explanation was short, the mustachioed man then seeking Song's eyes across the room and getting a nod in reply. Keep it quiet, Tristan murmured. Augusto will not be told, and if there is chatter the townsfolk may notice we are onto them. Of course, Cosmo nodded, stroking his mustache. I will be most careful, Tristan. I'll see you there, he smiled. That there did not happen to be a place where anyone but the 2 of them would be gathering was not something his father's executioner needed to know. Not yet. As the last of them began going up the stairs, Tristan lingered just long enough to watch darkness begin to creep through the shutters. Night had come to Kentika, the lamplights ringing the town doused one after another. Alas, there would be no sleep for him. His work was now beginning. Patience did most of the work. The thief waited until the innkeeper doused the last of the lights inside the last rest and left. There had been no doubt that the devil would, as a simple look at the size of the kitchen compared to the floor upstairs confirmed there was no chamber built for him to sleep in. Tristan waited for minutes more, then crept down the hall and the stairs. The windows were shuttered but the door was unlocked. Cracking it open, he peeked through. The streets were dark and empty, but there were lights in the distance. He snuck out, closing the door behind him. The lights, he saw when got out to have a better look, were from torches. The town square, he thought. Tristan stayed off the main street as he went, keeping to alleys and passing behind houses. He could not risk going out in the open. Not only did devils see in the dark, but they were said to have uncanny senses. His method got him close to the square, but the particular alley was a dead end. Tristan could dimly make out voices, but he was too far for anything useful. Grimacing, he eyed the side of the house he was hiding behind. There was a way up, with a little work. An empty crate, which creaked under his weight enough to have him wincing, got him a foot higher, enough he was able to wedge a foot against a jutting plank and grab at the edge of the tiled roof. Only the work was shoddy, he discovered, and if he held onto the tiles to pull himself fully onto the plank they were like as not to come loose. Swallowing a curse, the thief looked around for something to use and found a shovel with a bent head. He crept back down, took it and then tried to keep the crates groaning as a minimum as he wedged a foot against the plank again. Using the shovel as a counterweight, he pushed himself so he could stand on the jutting plank. He was careful not to let the shovel fall, propping it against the wall, and then climbed the rest of the way onto the roof. Creeping up the tiles, He pressed himself against the cool clay until he had reached the top of the roof, and from there found a commanding sight of the town square below. The thief breathed in sharply. There were only a few torches, held up by the handful of pale-skinned hollows in the square, but there must have been more than 50 people in the square. All of them looking like children of the glare, but as he watched them mill around the cages, Tristan could not help but feel they were slightly off. They weren't moving quite right, arms and legs sometimes bending more as the confirmation of movement than the reason. Not seeing anything. A man's voice, but stilted. Like it took too much care pronouncing every syllable. It was also coming from behind him, down in the alley. Tristan held his breath, pressed close against the roof and prayed. Some shuffling down in the alley. There were at least 2 of them. It was a rat, another voice said. The thrills are getting fat, I tell you. They don't hunt them as thoroughly as they used to. By the sound of it, one of the devils below kicked the shovel he left propped up. We better not have missed anything, the stilted voice said. A scoff that sounded ever so slightly of clicking mandibles. None of it means anything until the Kados gets here, the devil said. The fresh cast listened to him like he is some duke of hell. As if, the stilted voice snorted. He's not even an elder, A crate was kicked, Tristan almost flinching at the sound. Still dangerous, the other devil said. Watch your wagging. Angry hisses, then he heard the pair working away. Tristan held his breath until his lungs burned and his eyes watered, releasing it only when he was dead certain neither was close enough to hear him. That had been uncomfortably close. If he'd been just a little slower to climb. There was no time for fear to set in, however, as the crowd below coiled with unspoken tension. It was not hard to put a face to the source, as the devils around him all fell silent. The devil wore the skin of middle-aged man, Tristan saw, with broad shoulders and a balding pate. He had a vaguely Millennial look about him, and by the looks of the clothes the thief thought he was likely the town butcher. If that is not a Kados, I'll throw away my hat. The devil deftly leapt up to sit atop one of the cages, the crowd of his fellows rippling around him. Tristan's lips thinned. No man could have moved like that. It was simply not something people's legs were capable of. Mayor Crespin, or at least the devil wearing that skin and name, came to stand in the middle of the square and cleared his throat. Now that all are in attendance, he said, voice slightly buzzing, we can begin. We have a hunt and a hunter to choose this night. Do we? The crowd shivered. The butcher, the one Tristan thought might be the Sakados, had been the one to speak. It seems to me, the butcher continued, voice slow and lazy, that the rooks are in disarray. Their mountain collapsed. Their fort was buried. This year is a loss to them, good is written off. A scoff from another in the crowd. They gave us rules when they stranded us here, the other devil said. 100 years playing their game and the term is ended. Why should we risk the guns of the watch instead, Akados? To feed, the devil replied, voice hungry for all the laziness. Not the scraps they allow us, but to truly eat to our heart's content as we were made to. Not nibbling at done souls or breaking up a soul in pieces like biscuit, a proper meal. Done? Tristan frowned. It meant dark, he recalled, or perhaps drab. He might mean the hollows. Rather more worrying was that the oldest devil in Kentucky was attempting to talk the others into what sounded like a massacre of the trial takers, and there was not a great deal of opposition to it. Still some, however. Everyone knows you anneal from slaughter, a devil called out. You just want one to get closer to being evergreen, but what is that to us? Akados laughed. We all want to slaughter, vain, the devil replied, baring the teeth of a man and the pincer-like teeth of a devil behind them. To feel them writhe in the empty sea, to partake of the colors. I will gain, true, but who here would not? A challenging look. They will not come after us with powder and shot for a year that is already scrapped, Akados said. We are not so easily replaced. And if we can get away with it, what is staying our hand? Reading a crowd of devils was like trying to read foreigners through a panel of silk, Tristan thought, but were he inclined to bet he would have said the crowd was already halfway talked into it. It was only a matter of time now. Too many of the devils went eerily still whenever feeding was mentioned. The expressions of the shells gone slack with what? It was, Tristan mused, time to get the fuck out Kentucky before they all died. The arguing would at least serve to cover the sound of his sliding back down into the alley. Tristan crept away, more hastily than he had come, for he now felt the urgency biting at his back. Could he still pull things off with Cosme, now that he would not have the time to lay his ambush as he had planned? Maybe, he thought. He would need to take stock of things before deciding. Yet even as he snuck his way back to the last rest, the thief forced himself to take a detour. Angharate Trudiger would be leading her lost lambs out through the front gate, but Tristan had his sights set on the postern, for more reasons than one. It would be best to first see if there were guards near it. Likely not devils, he thought, but perhaps hollows. Foes nowhere as fearsome, but perfectly capable of raising the alarm. Steps silent, he turned the corner on the wooden sidewalk and risked a glance. The thief hissed in a breath, catching sight of movement and drawing back. He looked again, more carefully, and was relieved to see it was only one man with his back turned. The relief lasted only until he recognized the ragged cape he was looking at. With a soft cry of triumph, Augusto Chardon ripped open the postern gate and swiftly moved aside. This was, Tristan dimly thought as cultists began pouring into the town, going to be a problem. Tobe continued, "Thanks for listening.